The north of England was once the lifeblood of English and, by extension, world football. It was the industrial towns of Lancashire, like Darwin and Blackburn, that wrestled control of the sport away from Britain's aristocratic elites and paved the way for professionalism. The South Yorkshire city of Sheffield is home to the world's oldest football club, football stadium, and football rivalry. And it was the northeast, especially Newcastle, heavily influenced by players and thinkers from north of the border in Scotland, that revolutionised football tactics in England, with reverberations that still echo around the globe, over 100 years on. Sheffield rules, written in the 1850s, introduced corners and free kicks to football, as well as the development of heading, goalkeeping, and the modern concept of a forward. The FA's laws of the game, later adopted by FIFA, which have remained remarkably consistent since they were first published in 1863, were written by Ebenezer Cobb Morley, a former footballer turned solicitor from Hull. When the Football League was founded in 1888, there wasn't a single club south of West Bromwich, in the West Midlands, among its 12 founding members. It would be 16 years before the First Division got its first Southern club, namely Arsenal in 1904, and a remarkable 42 years before a Southern club finally won the First Division title, also Arsenal, in 1930. In the time between the Football League being founded and first won by a Southern club, Britain partitioned Ireland, mandated a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, fought in the First World War, and ceased to be the global hegemon. A busy 4 decades then. Likewise, in the FA Cup, after Blackburn Olympic dethroned the former private schoolboys in 1883, Tottenham were the only Southern club to lift the trophy, once as a non-league team, for nearly the next 50 years. Football eventually spread like wildfire, not just around England but throughout the entire globe, so it was no surprise that by the 1950s, the First Division was much more geographically diverse. Still boasting 11 northern clubs and 4 from the Midlands, but also 5 from the south, or 6, if you include Cardiff City in South Wales. By the final First Division season in 1991-92, prior to the breakaway of the Premier League, there had been further diversification, but the northern powerhouses remained a major force. Leeds United won the title, Sheffield Wednesday finished 3rd, and Sheffield United finished 9th. Out of the top 9 teams, there were 6 northern clubs and only 1 southern one. No southern clubs made either the FA Cup or the League Cup finals that season, which were contested by Nottingham Forest, Sunderland, Liverpool and Manchester United. As recently as the 2008-09 season, the Premier League boasted 11 northern clubs: Newcastle, Sunderland, Middlesbrough, Hull, Blackburn, Everton, Liverpool, Man United, Man City, Wigan and Bolton, and a further 3 from the Midlands. Outside of London, Portsmouth were the division's only southern club. Fast forward just 16 years, and the geography of the Premier League looks very different. Of those 11 northern clubs, only the 4 Merseyside and Manchester Giants and Newcastle United still remain. Even Everton have flirted with relegation in recent years. Meanwhile, Newcastle had been relegated twice in a little over 10 years before they were bought by the Saudi state in 2021. Outside of those 5, it is a bleak picture for the North. And I'm not just referring to job opportunities. Sunderland, who are 6-time champions of English football and have a higher average attendance than Chelsea, have played 4 seasons of League One football since they were last relegated from the Premier League. 4-time English champion Sheffield Wednesday have been Premier League absentee since the 1999-2000 season, spending 6 seasons in League One since then, and 3-time champions Leeds United, Huddersfield Town and Blackburn Rovers have been absent since 2023, 2019 and 2012 respectively. Sheffield United, Burnley, Middlesbrough, Preston North End and Hull City are all currently in the Championship, but elsewhere, things are even worse still. 2-time FA Cup winners Bury were liquidated in 2020, forced to start out again in the 10th tier of English football. Oldham Athletic became the first former Premier League club to drop all the way into the non-league game in 2022, and are yet to fight their way back out of the National League. And Carlisle United, who played top-flight football in the 1970s, are currently on the cusp of suffering back-to-back relegations, also into the non-league game. So, at the risk of opening up rather a large can of worms here, what has gone wrong in the north of England? Well, That's what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey from the Lake District to Kingston upon Hull, two of the most beautiful tourist destinations in Britain, if not in the entire world, as we take a look at why the number of Northern Premier League clubs has more than halved since 2009, why Southern and especially London clubs have enjoyed a meteoric rise during that same time, and what it all tells us about this random country that, apparently, hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. There is a temptation, when observing a widening north-south divide in England, to point immediately to regional inequalities. The explosion of football's popularity and the emerging dominance of northern clubs occurred in the immediate aftermath of the Industrial Revolution and during what has since become known as either the Second Industrial Revolution or the Technological Revolution. This was a period of rapid economic growth in the north of England which, whilst incredibly unequally distributed between individuals, in terms of the owners of capital and the workers, made the north of England as a whole much more prosperous. Lancashire and Leeds were powered by their cotton mills and textile factories, Sheffield by steel production, Liverpool by shipping and maritime trade, Hull by fishing, whaling and also shipping, Middlesbrough and Scunthorpe through iron making, and a whole host of cities and regions, including some of those already mentioned, like Sunderland, Newcastle, Durham, Barnsley and Sheffield, by coal mining. It is hard to find accurate financial statistics from the time, but it's likely that when the Football League was founded in 1888, 6 of the 10 richest cities in England were in the north, and 3 out of the remaining 4 were in the Midlands. At one time, the ward of Shaw in Oldham, Greater Manchester, was said to have the highest concentration of millionaires anywhere in England, if not in the entire world. Oldham is now among the 20% most deprived areas in England. A 2016 ONS study found that Oldham was literally the most deprived town in the country. In 2021, Oldham had an average household income of just £22,858, which is a third less than the national average. An enormous 44% of children in Oldham live in poverty. Oldham is just one example, albeit an especially stark one, of the economic realignment that has taken place in the United Kingdom over the last 150 years. While northern towns and cities boomed during the First and Second Industrial Revolutions, their wealth and job opportunities were extremely concentrated in a handful of predominantly heavy industries. Just as Britain led the globe in the Industrial Revolution, it also led the way when it came to deindustrialisation. In the 3 decades following Margaret Thatcher's 1979 election success, the UK's manufacturing industry shrank by 2/3. It has fallen further since then. While deindustrialisation is a familiar tale throughout Europe, and you can find heavily impacted left-behind communities, from the coal mines of Germany's Ruhr Valley to Italian shipbuilders in Genoa, Britain deindustrialised faster and to a greater extent than any other major nation. This was partly the result of a series of political decisions, some of them benevolent, when it came to attempts to modernise and pivot towards more blue-collar jobs, and some of them cynical, such as Thatcher's mission to destroy the trade unions, something that she succeeded in doing. In Thatcher's first term in office alone, a period of just 4 years, for those of you unfamiliar with British politics, 1 in 4 manufacturing jobs in Britain disappeared. The job losses continued throughout Thatcher's next 7 years in office, and both the Major and Blair years, with no government since then having taken any meaningful action to address the devastation that was wrought throughout vast swathes of the country, especially concentrated in the north. The shift towards globalisation, due to cheaper manufacturing costs in other countries, made elements of British deindustrialisation inevitable. The unforgivable crime was, and still remains, the lack of effort or will to heal the wounds left behind in these communities. Thatcher's view was to leave it all to the market, a force greater than Almighty God, but it seems as though God doesn't care much about cities like Liverpool, Sheffield, Barnsley and Sunderland, and their prayers for dignified, well-paying jobs have gone unanswered now for more than 40 years. This is now what a map of median income in England looks like. As you can see, there is lots of wealth and well-paid jobs concentrated in London, emanating out across the southeast and much of the south as a whole, but things start to look a little bit less positive as you head north, with only a few isolated exceptions, and particular pockets of deprivation scattered throughout Yorkshire, the northeast, and Wales. This has inevitable knock-on effects for football, of course, although I think that they can sometimes be somewhat overblown. Where thriving factory towns which once had thriving factory teams no longer have any factories, let alone thriving ones, and now have struggling teams languishing outside of English football's elite, we ought to guard against the idea that correlation automatically equals causation. For all of the economic hardship in much of the North, one thing that stands firm is football fandom and attendances. A 2020 study by J. James Reed, a professor of economics at the University of Reading, which charted the strength of English football clubs, as defined by their league position and ELO ranking at the time, against their home attendances, found that football fans in the North and in the Midlands tended to be more loyal than those in the South, in the sense that they were less flaky in terms of their support and attendance, depending upon the strength of performances of their team at any given moment or season. 11 of the 30 highest average attendances in English football can still be found in the north of England, and a further 8 in the Midlands. Sunderland, in the Championship, have a higher average attendance than either Chelsea or Everton. Fellow Championship side Leeds United have a higher attendance than either Leicester City or Brighton in the division above them, and Sheffield United average more than either Fulham or Crystal Palace. Heck, West Yorkshire club Bradford City have a higher average attendance in League 2, the 4th tier of English football, than Premier League Bournemouth, and they are practically neck and neck with Brentford. Both Bolton and Huddersfield, in League 1, have a higher average attendance than both Bournemouth and Brentford. The point being here, regional inequalities and economic headwinds which affect northern clubs haven't yet impacted attendances or matchday revenue in any meaningful sense. Newcastle's matchday revenue is higher than West Ham's, despite West Ham actually having a higher average attendance than them. Everton's matchday revenue, once they move into their new stadium, will likely become the 5th highest in England, and Leeds, Middlesbrough, Sunderland and Sheffield United all have matchday revenue, which is twice the size of Bournemouth's, despite being in the division below them. There are some minor impacts in terms of corporate and hospitality revenue, where having fewer wealthy supporters or local businesses willing to pay premium prices for more premium experiences reduces revenue somewhat, but this is negligible in the grand scheme of things, at least in terms of Premier League revenue outside of the Rich Six. Where location really matters isn't so much in terms of supporters and their demographics, as is often suggested, but in terms of owners, executives, and the players themselves. Gone are the days of football clubs being owned by local lads done well, like Jack Walker, who propelled his boyhood club Blackburn Rovers from the 2nd Division to the Premier League title by outspending every other club in England. Firstly, there are fewer local lads done well in the north of England these days, by virtue of the aforementioned lack of opportunities, and the requirement to move typically at a pretty early age, and typically to London, in order to access those more lucrative opportunities, and it is interesting that the modern day equivalents can be better found in the south than in the north, at clubs like Brighton and Brentford, both of whom are owned by fans, and secondly, because the wealth required at the top end of English football ownership is no longer accessible for local lads, or lasses, who have just done good. Jack Walker was worth £600 million, which would make him a billionaire today if you factored in inflation, with a net worth of around £1.1 to £1.2 billion. Now, that is more money than any human being could ever need, by a factor of about 1,000, but if Walker owned a Premier League club now, he would be the 3rd or 4th poorest owner in the division, rather than the super-rich chairman bankrolling Rovers' success. In a world of nation-states, oligarchs and asset management firms, with tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in assets under management, the likes of Walker are small fry by comparison. They can still compete, as the examples of Benham and Bloom at Brentford and Brighton illustrate, but that is down to intelligent management, outstanding recruitment, and world-class in-house data analytics software at least as much, if not even more so, than simply by being able to inject cash, and even then, Brentford and Brighton aren't able to achieve anything like the success that Walker managed in the 1990s, in the form of 3 successive top 4 finishes, signing the best striker in England, and winning a Premier League title. Walker had, effectively, 1/6 of the wealth of Fulham's current owners, 3% of Manchester United's, and less than 0.2% of Newcastle's. Of course, Nation-states, billionaire oligarchs, and American asset management firms aren't prohibited from buying northern clubs, and some of them have. England's two state-owned football clubs, one of them de facto and one of them de jure, are both northern clubs, Manchester City and Newcastle United. Sunderland and Barnsley are both owned by foreign multi-billionaires, and the likes of Liverpool, Everton and Burnley are all majority owned by American asset management firms. It is no surprise that the first two, at least, are among the northern clubs to have bucked the recent trend of decline and stagnation, and, in actual fact, the Northern Rich Six constituents basically operate in a different sphere for reasons, but broadly speaking, a lot of these owners prioritise things like accessibility, desirability, and, above all else, commercial opportunities. There has been an explosion in ownership regimes where a stadium, and developing the land around a stadium, appears to be as important, if not more important in some cases, than the club themselves. Land is of course at a premium around London, the South East, and in more desirable areas, which tends to make developing in those areas a more lucrative endeavour. The desirability of London and the South East to players, owners and executives probably needs some explanation, seen as though, if you spend any time listening to Elon Musk on the app formerly known as Twitter, then you could be forgiven for thinking that any time anyone steps out onto the streets of England's capital, they are immediately mugged, stabbed, and then left to bleed out by a horde of marauding immigrants. And not the good immigrants, the ones who staff your software and engineering departments, but the bad ones, who mug, stab, and then leave you to bleed out. And once you're dead, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves turn up to arrest you for being English, or having been English before you were dead, or something like that. Look, I can't keep up, alright? It is amazing some of the insights that these Americans have into everyday life in England that has somehow gone unnoticed by the people who actually live here. London, it should be said, and the UK as a whole, is not without its faults. In fact, I could make a whole series about them, and part 1 in a 24-part series would be about 8 hours long, but even at its most dangerous and crime-infested, London is, nonetheless, still safer than any major city in the United States. Meanwhile, 4 out of the 5 European regions with the lowest homicide rates are located in, lo and behold, the United Kingdom. The biggest complaints about London, among people who actually live there, aside from the Central Line, almost always relates to the cost of living, especially the extortionate cost of housing, in terms of both house prices and rent, but also just day-to-day expenses. I once saw it said that the best thing about London is that you can do everything there, but the worst thing is that you can't afford to do anything there, and for a lot of people, that is basically true. The West End is incredible, but only if you can afford to go. London has some of the best restaurants in the world, but you won't experience many of them if your rent accounts for 60% of your income. You'll still find some of the finest tailors in the world on Savile Row, and shoemakers on Jermyn Street, but at £6,500 for a suit from Anderson & Shepherd, and £2,000 for a pair of Edward Green loafers, the benefits of London's high-end sartorial offering isn't especially accessible to ordinary Londoners. For the rich and super rich, however, unimpeded by the high cost of living, London remains one of the best places to live and spend time anywhere on the planet. Premier League footballers are now almost all insanely highly paid, and many of them want to live a certain lifestyle which, in England, only the capital can afford them. In the summer of 2014, Alexis Sanchez had the option of joining either Liverpool or Arsenal, but he chose the latter, in large part, according to Liverpool's former CEO and director Ian Ayre, because he and his family wanted to live in London. Sanchez isn't alone. Eden Hazard and Cesc Fabregas both reportedly favoured moves to Chelsea, situated in one of London's most affluent boroughs, over Manchester United, whose stadium is situated in Salford, the 18th most deprived regional authority in England. That is despite the fact that almost all Manchester United, Manchester City, and even Everton and Liverpool players live in the so-called Golden Triangle, which is made up of a pocket of affluent towns and villages in Cheshire, which is about 5 miles across, and where the average house costs over £1 million. Even the gated communities and revolting crushed velvet mansions of the Golden Triangle can't quite compete with London, which is one of only 2 Alpha++ rated cities in the world, along with New York City. Ukrainian wireman Andrei Yarmolenko also reportedly chose West Ham over Newcastle in 2018, when both clubs wanted to sign him from Borussia Dortmund because he and his family wanted to live in London, and the likes of Willian, Aubameyang, Pedro, Declan Rice, Joao Felix and Gonzalo Higuain, among others, are all reported to have either turned down moves to northern clubs in favour of London clubs, at least in part because they wanted to live in London, or to have advised their agents that they were only interested in a move to England if it meant London, before things even reached that stage. I have even been told of one player, off the record, although who knows, there could be more, who factored proximity to Harrods, the luxury department store in Kensington, into he and his family's thinking when deciding to join one London club over another one. Again, I am sure that wasn't the only factor that he or his family considered, but this stuff isn't myth or legend. Insanely wealthy footballers and their families are spoilt for choice, and can often afford to be picky about where they want to live. None of this is particularly new or revelatory. An irate Roy Keane, I know, it's not like him, is it? Complained 18 years ago, back when the Premier League still had 10 northern clubs, twice as many as it has now, that players were turning down northern clubs in favour of the capital for non-football reasons. Managing Sunderland at the time, Keane stated, quote, "If a player doesn't want to come to Sunderland, then all well and good. But if he decides he doesn't want to come because his wife wants to go shopping in London, then it's a sad state of affairs. It's not a football move, it's a lifestyle move. It tells me the player is weak and his wife runs his life." He added, quote, "The idea of women running the show concerns me and worries me, but the players we're talking about are soft. Priorities have changed in footballers, and they are being dictated to by their wives. It's different with Chelsea, Arsenal, or maybe Tottenham, but if players are starting to go to clubs just because they're in London, and they're not even that big a club, it's clearly down to the shops. We had a player who didn't even ring us back this summer because his wife wanted to move to London and, yes, shopping was mentioned. To me, it's wrong to sign for a club with half the crowds and less attention." End quote. The former Manchester United captain, who has never knowingly been influenced by his spouse, ended his rant by hammering home his point, stating, quote, "You can see quite clearly now with one or two of the big players that their wives and girlfriends are running their lives and that's a bad sign. I might have to start persuading players that Sunderland's closer to London than it really is. The player won't say it, but you know what they're thinking because they say, 'I need to speak to my wife.'" End quote. Now, when uprooting your family, often including children, it probably does make some sense to speak to your wife. Call me a soy boy, beta, cuck, simp, or whatever the term that is in vogue at the moment may be, but I think that unilaterally deciding to relocate your family without consulting your wife probably isn't a recipe for a happy or successful marriage, but skating over Keane's sketchy marriage advice and stripping the players themselves of any agency whatsoever, as if it were inconceivable that any multimillionaire footballers might also prefer to live in Kensington or Hampstead than, say, Sunderland themselves, it is clear that the London bias among players has been around for a while now, and it has grown stronger in the nearly 2 decades since Keane's rant. There is a certain irony, insofar as in almost every other field and industry, employees are paid more for doing the same role in London than elsewhere in England, because there is an acknowledgement of the higher cost of living. Yet, in football, the precise opposite is often true. Because London and the South East are perceived as being especially desirable places to live for super rich players, clubs in the North are sometimes forced to pay a premium. It is a sort of not London tax, whereby you might have to pay an Italian or a Brazilian an additional 10% for the pain and anguish caused by having to live 4 hours away from Harrods. I know, it's a hard life. Former Wigan Athletic assistant and caretaker boss Frank Barlow, speaking to The Athletic last year, stated, quote, "Dave Whelan used to say that if you have a club in London, say Fulham, who wants a player, then to get that player to come to Wigan you have to offer something, and that something is money. That's not wrong by the player, he's a professional, it's his job." Barlow added, quote, "It definitely happens. If a club in the North and one in London offer the same salary, the player will go to London. Ask any Northern manager. So it's like running a car. If you've got an Aston Martin, you've got to inject a lot of fuel to keep going. To stay in the Premier League requires large injections of cash, and it might only keep you where you are. Where does that cash come from? End quote. It is a sort of upside-down world, but it seems plausible, at least, that football clubs in the most deprived parts of England are having to pay a premium precisely because they are located in deprived areas in order to convince very rich footballers to live close enough to them to commute into their training grounds. A lot of people outside of Britain probably struggle to grasp or comprehend just how London-centric the UK is. As Britain's cultural, economic, and political capital, it's sometimes been described as being like if LA, New York, and Washington DC were all rolled into one. The UK is the most capital or single city-centric major developed nation in the world, far exceeding even the dominance of Paris and the Ile-de-France region in France, or the enormous Tokyo metropolitan area in Japan. Only Seoul, which is home to about half of South Korea's total population, provides a compelling comparison. After that, you have got to go down to countries like Argentina with Buenos Aires, Turkey with Istanbul, Russia with Moscow, or the daddy of all single city countries, Iceland with Reykjavik, which is home to 64% of the country's entire population, to find so-called primate cities that can compete with London. As a result, London is by far the best connected city in the UK in terms of transport links. 4 out of the 5 busiest UK airports start with the word London, even the ones that aren't actually in London. Manchester in third is the only exception, and London is also connected to mainland Europe by high-speed rail. 6 of the UK's 10 busiest airports for private jets are also located in London and in the southeast. That makes it easier for players to go on summer and mid-season holidays to more destinations, and yes, that is a tangible benefit for some, but far more significantly, it makes it a lot easier for foreign players, who account for nearly 70% of all Premier League players at this stage, to travel home and see their families, or indeed, for their families to come and see them. London and the southeast lifestyle and connectivity benefits for the rich are so significant that Sunderland and Newcastle both previously either contemplated, or at least it was suggested to them, that they could relocate their training grounds to somewhere in London or in the southeast, and have their players commute only every other week for match days instead. It's the type of suggestion that really brings home just how far English football clubs, at the highest level, have drifted from their roots and the communities they are supposed to represent. What's more, it might sound far-fetched, and thankfully, it hasn't yet materialised, but there are northern clubs who, if not quite fully relocated, have opened London offices in order to establish a presence there and hire staff in the capital. The City Football Group, who own Manchester City, and are themselves majority owned by the Abu Dhabi United Group, have an office on the 14th floor of Regent's Place at 10 Brock Street in central London, the same building where Facebook and Meta now have their London headquarters. Manchester United have had their commercial headquarters in London, not Manchester, since 2013, which was formerly in Mayfair but which has been in Kensington for the last 2 years, although you won't be surprised to discover that Jim Ratcliffe is considering shutting it down as a cost-cutting measure. Along with everything else, Liverpool also opened a corporate office in London in 2014, just a year after Manchester United, which can still be found in Fitzrovia, central London, and Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, or PIF, which owns Newcastle United, opened a London office in 2022, a year after they acquired the club. While in the Championship, Leeds United owner Massimo Cellino reportedly considered relocating Leeds' head office to the capital as well. There are strategic reasons for northern clubs to have a London footprint. If you can't convince senior executives to come to you, then why not go to them? But there are no Chelsea offices in Merseyside, Tottenham corporate headquarters in Manchester, or West Ham United presence in the northeast. It's not just the demographics of owners that have shifted though, but also the players themselves. When nearly 70% of Premier League players are from overseas, it can be easy for people to overestimate how much they care about a club's history, success, or support, versus how much they care about their training ground and facilities, their own development, and how much money they're going to be paid. Make no mistake, there is still a certain allure about playing for Manchester United or Liverpool because they are two of the biggest clubs in the world. But no player from South America, and very few even from England in all truth, is joining Sunderland or Leeds in the Championship over Bournemouth or Brighton in the Premier League, despite the former, Sunderland that is, having 10 trophies to Bournemouth's none, and 4 times the attendances. Even in terms of divisional rivals, Brighton are now a more attractive prospect to most players than Everton, owing to their facilities, track record in terms of player development, and the high regard they're held in when it comes to allowing players to move on to bigger and better things. Despite Everton being an institution of the English game, 9-time English champions, and a top-flight club uninterrupted since the mid-1950s, whereas Brighton have never won a major trophy of any description, only reached the Premier League in 2017, and last played top-flight football prior to that in the 1980s. It is also easy to forget just how young footballers are. If you're a 23-year-old like, say, Bukayo Saka, William Saliba, or Joao Pedro, Sheffield Wednesday haven't been a top-flight football club during your entire lifetime, and Sunderland haven't been one during your adult life, whereas Crystal Palace have been Premier League mainstays since you were 11 years old. So even in terms of the extent to which stature or prestige matters, in terms of recent stature and prestige, Northern clubs still face an uphill battle. The fact that Southern clubs, as a rule, have prioritised the development of academies and training facilities, more so than Northern clubs, has also resulted in a shift not just in terms of recruitment and how desirable clubs are to foreign players, but also in terms of domestic production and homegrown talent. It used to be the case that the North provided the beating heart of the England team. If you look at England's Italia 90 or Euro 96 semi-finalists, for example, the likes of Gazza, Shearer, Waddle, Beardsley, Robson and McManaman were all from the North and, in fact, all but McManaman were from the North East. The current stars of the England team, by contrast, like Kane, Saka and Rice, are all Londoners, Jude Bellingham is from Birmingham, Ollie Watkins is from Torquay, and Jared Bowen is from Herefordshire. The North is still well represented, of course, through the likes of Phil Foden, Cole Palmer and Trent Alexander-Arnold, but the great talent factories of English football have shifted, or at least have begun to shift, away from the North East and, to a lesser extent, the North West, and southwards towards London and, particularly it would seem, South London. I have touched upon a lot of the macro factors in this video, which disadvantage Northern clubs to varying degrees, but it is also just worth acknowledging some of the micro factors. A lot of Northern clubs, when looked at in isolation, have just been dreadfully run, while several Southern clubs have benefited from far more capable ownership regimes and more talented senior executives. Sunderland, for example, may face some hurdles that West Ham or Crystal Palace don't when it comes to attracting and recruiting players, but no one forced them to hand mega contracts to Manchester United has-beens Jack Rodwell or Ricky Alvarez. That was down to an American, Ellis Short, and a series of dreadful off-field decisions which led to back-to-back relegations from the Premier League down into League One. Leeds United bombed out of the Premier League spectacularly 20 years ago, not primarily because players didn't want to live in Leeds or because they were too far from Harrods, but because Peter Ridsdale decided to gamble their future earnings and go into enormous debt in the hope of becoming regulars in the Champions League. When Leeds missed out, in successive seasons, the walls caved in, ultimately leading to another double relegation just like Sunderland down to League One, administration, and 2 separate 10 and 15 point deductions. Even my own club, Hull City, after reaching the Premier League for the first time in 2008, were almost liquidated, having amassed enormous debts in the top flight when we came back down in 2010. During the club's most successful era, meanwhile, which included Premier League survival, an FA Cup final, and qualifying for the Europa League, the Alum ownership regime needlessly spurned all of that by embarking upon a petty feud with the local council, and later the club's supporters, attempting to change Hull City's name to Hull Tigers, and telling supporters that they could, and I quote, die when they want. As a result, despite bucking the trend of northern decline and stagnation a decade ago, spending 5 seasons in 9 years in the Premier League, and being the best club in Yorkshire, overall, for more than a decade, this is what Hull City's training ground looks like in 2025. There are League Two clubs with more impressive facilities. Compare and contrast that with Brighton, Palace, or, pretty soon, Bournemouth's new training facilities, three similarly sized, or, in Bournemouth's case at least, even smaller clubs. This is no one's fault other than the incompetent, and at times malignant owners of northern clubs. By contrast, the three historic southern minnows, all beginning with Bs for some reason, Brighton, Bournemouth and Brentford, who were in League 1 in Brighton's case and League 2 in both Bournemouth and Brentford's back in 2008-09, when Hull City reached the Premier League and there were 11 northern clubs in the top flight, have been among the most phenomenally run clubs not just in England, but in all of Europe during that time. Whilst Leeds United paid £40 million to and for Jean-Kevin Augustin, who never played for them after they signed him, and who they claimed never to have signed before losing multiple court cases, Brentford signed Ollie Watkins for £1.8 million and sold him for £33 million, David Raya for £3 million and sold him for £30 million, and Ivan Toney for £5 million, rising to £10 million subject to add-ons, who they sold last summer for £40 million. There are many such examples. There are benefits to Brentford being in West London, Brighton being affluent on the south coast and only about an hour from London, and Bournemouth, though much further from the capital, still being an attractive resort town on the south coast, but they have been able to make use of those inbuilt regional and geographic advantages because they have got so many big decisions right over the last 10 to 15 years. Queen's Park Rangers, by contrast, who were among the worst-run Premier League teams of all time, are 14th in the Championship now, despite also being in West London, as opposed to 11th in the Premier League, as a result of being much worse run than Brentford, and Charlton Athletic, much like Bolton Wanderers, have gone from being in the Premier League in the 2000s to League One now, rather than becoming mid-table Premier League mainstays, as a result of a series of dreadful owners, unlike the stable and competent leadership at their South London rivals Crystal Palace, who have managed to do just that. What's more, a compelling case can be made that the regional divide is as much between North East and North West as it is between North and South, or, alternatively, between London and the rest. While Blackburn, Wigan and Bolton have all fallen upon hard times and are a part of this story, the North West continues to be the most dominant region in England when it comes to winning trophies, through Manchester United throughout the first 20 years of the Premier League era, and more recently Manchester City and Liverpool. Whether you look at a 10, 20, 30 or even 50-year time horizon, approximately 70% of all champions of English football are clubs from the northwest of England. That has remained pretty much a constant. The northeast, by contrast, and Yorkshire, from Leeds, Bradford and Huddersfield to Sheffield, Barnsley, Grimsby and Hull, is where you find a total collapse. The rising dominance of London, which now has 7 Premier League clubs, and the total collapse of Yorkshire, which had 4 Premier League clubs, including the reigning champions, at the start of the Premier League era but now has none, is the defining geographic tale in English football over the last 30 years. Yorkshire is the largest county in England by area, actually subdivided into north, east, south and west owing to its size, and second only to Greater London by population, home to more than 5 million people. Yorkshire is over 60% of the size of Greater London, so you might expect it to have 60% as many Premier League teams. Instead, whilst London has 7, this season at least, Yorkshire doesn't have a single one. Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, which are almost half the size of Yorkshire, have 2 each. But then, there are also areas in the south that are just as underrepresented. Almost 2 million people live in Essex, but the county's best football club competes in League 2, the 4th tier of the English game. Even more people live in Kent, yet the county's top club, and only league club, Gillingham, also competes in League 2. Over 1 million people live in Surrey, which is in the southeast of England, yet the county has literally never had a single football league club. The southwest of England is a barren wilderness when it comes to football, compared to the struggling but still vibrant and well-supported clubs in Yorkshire and the northeast. Bristol, which is the 8th largest city in England, hasn't had a top-flight football team for 45 years. The entire southwest of England is home to nearly 6 million people, making it even larger than Yorkshire, yet it has a far inferior offering in terms of clubs. Most people would struggle to even name a club from Somerset, Gloucestershire and Dorset, which have a combined population of more than 2.5 million people. It seems less unusual because 'twas ever thus, but there is almost nowhere in the north that can rival that degree of per capita underachievement within the sport. Cumbria is pretty miserable right now, but fewer than 500,000 people live there. There is also a cyclical nature to some of these things. The situation for northern clubs in the Premier League looks especially dire this season as a result of Burnley and Sheffield United going down last season, whilst Ipswich, Leicester and Southampton came up, the latter after beating Leeds United in the playoff final. There isn't a single southern club among the top 6 in the Championship right now, and the top 4, Leeds, Sheffield United, Burnley and Sunderland, are all northern clubs. So it is guaranteed that the makeup of the Premier League next season will be at least slightly more northern than it is now. The likes of Palace, Brentford and Bournemouth, meanwhile, will have to continue to get the big decisions right and avoid any major slip-ups in order to maintain their top-flight status. So that's a part of it, but only a part. Even within the cyclical nature of football, there has been a definite shift, not just from 125 years ago, when there were no southern clubs in the top flight of English football, but from just 15 or 16 years ago, when there were 11 northern clubs, compared to just 5 now. Half of the Premier League's rich 6 are northern clubs, who are insulated from a lot of these challenges. Meanwhile, Newcastle United's Saudi state ownership arguably makes that a rich 7 and gives them an almost equally emphatic comfort blanket. The rest, however, from Blackpool to Borough, have fared less well, and for all of the reasons addressed in this video, most of which are actually deepening rather than in any way being rectified at this moment in time, much of that is likely to be a permanent realignment. Except for Hull City, obviously, who will have won the Premier League in just a couple of years, and the Champions League most likely the season after that. I'm sorry, we are unstoppable, and immune to the forces of politics, socioeconomics, and indeed, the laws of gravity. I don't make the rules. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it or found it in any way remotely entertaining or informative, or, just better than being in immense pain. If that was the case, hit the like button. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potts Armour, where I will soon be uploading my 5th video. I know, I can hear the tangible excitement among the audience. Both of those should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos, one from each, that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on various social media platforms and elsewhere on the internet via the various links down in the video description below. Cheers, and have a brilliant day.